Well, my summer job in high school and college, as I've told you before, was working for my uncle, who is a carpenter. And when we would go to the work site, we would take his truck and we would pull a trailer that was about 20 feet enclosed trailer. And that trailer imposed a heavy burden on the truck. Between the weight of the trailer and the wind resistance, it decreased the fuel efficiency of the truck, as well as imposed more wear and tear on the truck. But we took that trailer to the work site because it held most every tool we would need to actually do the job. But more importantly, it also contained a microwave that made lunch much more enjoyable. But the trailer was a burden on the truck, but it was worth it because it allowed us to do the job more efficiently and effectively without having to run here and there all over the place. So it was a burden that my uncle chose to incur because of the benefit. And there are times we incur burdens in our lives because we receive something in turn. The trailer was brought because it housed all the tools. But we also need to make sure that we incur burdens when it's the right thing to do. And not necessarily just morally. I'm talking about the burdens that God calls us to bear. Because we're all called to bear burdens. And burden has just this negative connotation that makes us want to stay away from it as much as possible. But in the story of Ruth, we find burdens. We find people taking on responsibility that they didn't necessarily have to incur. See, Ruth and Naomi were widows. Ruth was Naomi's daughter-in-law, so Ruth's husband and her sons had died, and so they were widows, and widows in the ancient world didn't have many prospects, just didn't have a lot going for them. And in fact, unless something happened, they weren't going to have that great of a life in regards to prosperity from an economic standpoint. But they come across this guy named Boaz, and Boaz was generous to Ruth, way more than he needed to, and he said, I am a kinsman redeemer of yours. And what that means is it was his responsibility to make sure someone like widows were taken care of, and he was a close relative. But Boaz wasn't the closest. There was a kinsman redeemer who was closer, who is his responsibility. So Boaz goes to this guy, and in Ruth chapter 4, he calls him friend. And, sometimes we use different pronouns because we don't remember somebody's name. Hey, you, right? You've been there before. We've done that kind of stuff. And it wasn't as though he didn't know this guy's name. The issue was that this guy is not important. In fact, in Ruth chapter 4, verse 1, he calls him friend, and friend in Hebrew is Peloni Almoni, which is an idiom that means his name is not important. So literally in this story, this guy is referred to as somebody who is not important. So it's likely that he's not going to play a big role in the story. But we continue on in Ruth chapter 4. So after Boaz got the friend, the near kinsman redeemer, he called the elders of the town and asked them to sit as witnesses. And he said to the friend, you know Naomi, who has come back from Moab. She is selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should speak to you about it so you can redeem it if you wish. If you want the land, then buy it here in the presence of these witnesses. If you do not want it, let me know right away because I am next in line to redeem it after you. And the friend replied, all right, I will redeem it. So this is the protocol that had to happen. Boaz said that he would be a kinsman redeemer for Ruth if necessary, but he had to take the proper protocol because he was not first in line to do it. So he called the elders of the town and brought them together. And so they could bear witnesses and have basically a judgment and validate the process here. And so there's a debate, depending on the version of the Bible, the translation that you're reading, and there's a debate on if Naomi is selling the land or if Elimelech, her late husband, already sold the land. But regardless of what's happening here, the kinsman redeemer will be responsible to acquire the land somehow, whether it's purchasing it from Naomi or purchasing it from whoever else has it. So that's the core essence of what the kinsman redeemer would need to do. And Israelites had a great understanding for the land and what it meant to them. Because the promised land is where they lived. Because it was God had given them the land. And it was more than just a piece of property. It was God's blessing in their life. And they valued it so much within their own family units is that you could only sell the land for so long. After so many years, the land would revert back to the original family. But Boaz comes to the friend and he states his intentions. He's clear. He says, hey, I want to be the kinsman redeemer. If you're not going to do it, I want to do it. So we see with Boaz that honorable people incur honorable burdens. It was not his responsibility. He didn't have to take care of this. He didn't have to go and seek this friend. It was not his responsibility, but he did it. Now we have a twist. As I said, the guy is called friend, and meaning that he's not important, but yet he says he will redeem it. And in regards to protocol, this friend had dibs, I guess, over Boaz. He was the one first in line to redeem it. So the friend sees what's happening here and sees that there's a unique opportunity. Sees Naomi is selling this piece of property. He needs to acquire this land from Elimelech, who has no other descendants. And so this guy, this friend, sees that if he makes this purchase, this land will always be with his family because there's no other family for it to revert back to. Might be a little foreign concept for us, but so it was a financial win for him. So he knew it would be beneficial for his family, particularly in the long run. But that's not where the story ends. Boaz has kind of set up the friend a little bit. So he continues. He says, of course, your purchase of the land from Naomi also requires that you marry Ruth, the Moabite widow, that she can have children who will carry on her husband's name and keep the land in their family. And the friend said, then I can't redeem it because it might endanger my own estate. You redeem the land, I cannot. So Ruth is part of the redemption. She's part of the equation here that the friend needs to take account of. She changes the value of the property. Because no longer would it always be the friends and his families. It would go back to Elimelech and Ruth and all their family. It would go back to them. Now here's the thing. If the friend was willing to redeem the land when it was advantageous to him, he should have been willing to do it when it wasn't. He should have been willing to incur the burden, even though it wouldn't have been a wise financial decision for him. And on a lot of levels, Boaz he sets him up and then shames him, puts him in his place a little bit. I don't know if we feel better about it for the fact that he doesn't actually have a name. He's not important to the story. But he's not willing to fulfill his responsibilities. He's not willing to do the things that he should do. Now, he states the fact that he can't afford it. It might endanger his own estate. He wouldn't be able to financially make it work. Again, because Ruth changed the equation. Without Ruth, this was a really sweet, good deal for the friend. But with Ruth, the friend would lose the money that he used to purchase the field as well as the field. So he would be paying double for nothing, is essentially what he would have to do. So he swallows his pride, and maybe we give him props for not overcommitting. But before we do that, we need to make sure we recognize that this is a spiritual issue more than it's a financial issue. Too many times, I think we make the same mistake the friend makes. Well, I just can't make the numbers work, so God, I can't be faithful to you right now. If we actually let that sink in, that should hit us pretty hard. Because it's real easy to say, well, God, the numbers don't work, so unless you do something, I'm just going to do it on my own. That's how we tend to act. That's how we tend to respond. Because what we're doing is we're expressing limits to what God can do in our life. The friend was saying, well, this is what God wants me to do, but he won't make it work beforehand, so I'm not going to do it. Instead of allowing God to bless you with the sacrifice, we're saying, God, we want the blessing before we make the sacrifice. So they have this agreement to transfer the property, and what they would do, I don't know why, but they would take off the sandal and give it to the other person as a sign of transferring the property. And so the friend took off a sandal and was giving it to Boaz, and he said, you buy the land. And then Boaz said to the elders in the crowd, you are witnesses today that I have bought all of the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon And with the land I've acquired Ruth, the Moabite widow of Mahlon, to be my wife. This way she can have a son to carry on the family name of her dead husband and to inherit the family property here in his hometown. You are all witnesses today." Then the elders in the crowd replied, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, from whom all the nation of Israel descended. May you prosper and be famous in Bethlehem. And may the Lord give you descendants by this young woman who will be like those of our ancestor Perez, the son of Tamar in Judah." So we have this transfer. The transfer takes place. And so Boaz, who said he would be the kinsman redeemer, is actually going to be the kinsman redeemer. He accepts it and publicly declares it. So it's official. It's going to happen. He is going to be the kinsman redeemer. Throughout the story, Boaz stands in contrast to a lot of different people. And this is pretty obvious how he stands in contrast to the friend. Friend is not willing to take his responsibility. He's not willing to do that because the sacrifice is too great in his mind. But Boaz has taken initiative to do this. He contrasted Naomi earlier in the story. Naomi was acting with haste and worry and panic, and he was calm and cool and collective, and he did all he could to reassure Naomi and Ruth. He contrasted Elimelech. Remember in Ruth chapter 1, Elimelech took his family, left the promised land, and went to the neighboring country of Moab, whom Israel didn't like because there was a famine in the land. Things weren't working out, so he said, "I'm going to go do it myself." But Boaz stayed in the promised land, stayed faithful to God. And he stands in contrast to all these people, not because he's just this fantastic, amazing person, but because he said, "God, I'm going to keep my eyes fixed upon you." Too many times we overcomplicate it. We think about, we've got to do all these grand gestures, but a lot of times it's in the little decisions that we make to be faithful to God. And because of Boaz's faithfulness, he experienced the Hebrew word hesed. Hesed is blessing or kindness. That's the word we commonly translate it. But it's deeper than that. It's about this undying loyalty for goodness in your life. He experienced God's hesed in his life because of his faithfulness to God. He experienced God's willingness to bless him and give him goodness and commit to him because Boaz was faithful to God and sacrificed to him. But because of Boaz's hesed, others experienced the hesed as well. See, when he accepted the responsibility of being faithful to God and his law, he received this hesed. And honorable people incur honorable burdens, not just for the sake of incurring a burden, but because we're faithful to who God is. But in order to make this work, he made this public announcement and made it official. And we don't actually see that there's money exchanged, but he pays Naomi for the land. He does what he's supposed to, and the land now transfers to Naomi's children, or to Ruth's children, with her and Boaz. There's not much benefit to Boaz in this process. We need to make sure we recognize that from Boaz's perspective, he wasn't going to get much out of this. Now, he'd have relationships, he'd have friendships, he'd have kids, but those kids would be the sons of Mahlon, Ruth's deceased husband. That's how it worked in the Jewish system. So he wasn't getting anything out of this. But we have to make sure we recognize Boaz made all these sacrifices, but Ruth made sacrifices as well. See, in Ruth chapter 1, Ruth is a Moabite. She is from Moab. And she intentionally decides to leave Moab, rejecting the paganistic lifestyle and choosing Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God that we serve. She took risk by leaving what was known and coming to God. And so in Ruth, we also see the honorable people incur honorable burdens. Choosing to serve God is a burden. Anything we choose to do is a burden. Whether we're talking about paying bills, whether we're talking about just being a good neighbor, those things are a burden, not in a negative way, but in a way that imposes responsibility on us. But then they have this little kind of few phrases at the end that the elders in the crowd about blessing Boaz, and they kind of drop this Perez and Judah and Tamar in there. And you may think, okay, whatever. If you think about that story and what that represents, it's not a real big compliment to Boaz. Because Judah's son E-R, great name, married Tamar. Died. And so what the next thing was supposed to happen is that Judah's next son, Onan, was supposed to marry Tamar. And so he married Tamar, but then Onan died and still had no kids. And so he had another son, Selah. But Judah's like, I don't want to give my last son to this woman because all my sons are cursed. So he basically did some shady things, withheld that from Tamar, and basically left her to be destitute. Through a long string of events that weren't real God-honoring, Judah and Tamar had a son named Perez. So by the elders and the crowd talking about Judah and Tamar, it was a reminder to Boaz that he had a family history of people who didn't do the right thing. They had a family history of people who weren't necessarily faithful or good. So Boaz and Ruth have checkered past. They have things in their history that aren't great, that aren't encouraging, that things that just don't make them feel good about their lineage. But we find with them, as with us, that the perfect God uses imperfect people. He uses us regardless of our imperfections. Not that we should be frivolous, not that we should do things contrary to God just because we can, but we have the assurance that no matter where we are, God can use us and His glory can shine in and through us. I want to remind you that God knows your needs. He knows what you're going through. He knows your hopes, your worries, your dreams. And God's plan of redemption includes you. It doesn't possibly include you. God has a plan of redemption and He wants you to be part of it. The plan is for you to experience redemption, but the plan also calls you to help others experience redemption. If all we do is absorb from God, then we're missing what He has for us. We don't have to necessarily do these big, grand gestures. What we're called to be is faithful in our own context. You can't change everything in the world, but you can change the world in which you live. You can change your neighborhood. You can change your workplace. You can change your family. Boaz did what was right in his context. He was generous to Ruth. He was a kinsman redeemer. He didn't change something that was hundreds and thousands of miles away. He changed things that were right in his own home. Ruth made choices as well that were faithful. She was faithful to God. She chose to be faithful to God, to follow Him. She did what she could where she was. So as I think about Boaz and Ruth, I feel as though that when the people with control do what is right, those who are exploited receive freedom, and everybody experiences Hesed. Everyone experiences God's blessing. So maybe you don't necessarily know how to apply that today. Because when we talk about the grand scheme of things, okay, we can push this off on somebody else. You know, we can think about our current racial tensions in the world. And we can say, well, when those who have control, if they would do what was right, then everybody else would be good. Well, that's pushing things miles away or off in the distance or out of mind, whatever that necessarily looks like. But we find the story of Ruth and Boaz. Everyone had a part to play. Ruth had to leave Moab and come to Israel. Boaz had to be generous. Ruth had to work in the field. She had to do things. But Ruth was the one who was exploited. Boaz was the one who had control. And Boaz did what was right. So Ruth experienced freedom, and they both experienced Hesed. We can experience Hesed in this world when we do our part. And I hope this is just not some cliche mentality. Because each and every one of us has a responsibility to do what is right. When our actions honor God, that's only when we receive His Hesed. And this is more than well wishes. It's more than just feeling good about ourselves. It's a blessing that's deeper than this world can promise. It's blessing than anything this world can hope for. When we do what is right, God will pour His blessing out on us. When we're faithful to Him, He'll make the numbers work. When we're faithful to Him, we experience his Hesed.